Good evening and welcome to the Housing Element Update. This is Housing 201, the Housing Site Suggestion Map. My name is Diane Friedman. I am the Deputy Director of Development Services for the town of Danville. We are joined by Dave Crompton, who is the Chief of Planning, and Kat Bravo, who is our Administrative Analyst in the Town Manager's Office. We are so glad that you can join us this evening. We are in phase 2 of our outreach program regarding the housing element update process. And we're going to go over a few things tonight, give you an overview. We started this process last March. And what we're going to do tonight is we're going to recap what we started last year with the Housing Element 101 sessions. We are going to talk about our community outreach program, where we are. We're going to talk about what our next engagement activities are for the community and how they inform the decision-making process and what they are and how to use them. We're going to do a little demonstration tonight on how you can help with picking some of these suggested sites. And then after that, we're going to have a Q&A session. We will be here as long as you have questions. Next slide, Kat. All right, we're going to turn it over to Dave Crompton, who's going to give you an overview of the housing element nuts and bolts.
All right, thank you, Diane. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the housing element, why we need one, what it is. This is stuff that we've talked about over the course of the last year, but just want to give you a little refresher here. So what is a housing element and why do we need it? So number one, we need it because it is state law. State law that goes all the way back in California into 1969 requires every city and county in the state to have a housing element. And every housing element has to do a good job of planning for how a community is going to meet its fair share of its own housing needs and regional housing needs. Next slide. So what is a housing element? We plan to accommodate the existing projected housing needs, and it incorporates assigned housing targets set by the state. And we must do a new one every 8 years. So every 8 years, new projections, new housing elements. This is the one that we're working on now is the 6th round of housing elements. And it's also important to remember that cities don't, or most cities do not build homes. Danville certainly doesn't build homes, and a housing element does not require that the homes be built. We don't have control over private developers either. But what a housing element must do is show that we have enough land set aside that is zoned appropriately at the correct densities to provide for our housing assignment. What does a housing element include? It has goals, policies, programs, and objectives that kind of help us kind of roadmap to how we're going to get to our goals for our housing needs. It has an analysis of our housing needs locally and regionally. Evaluates constraints that we might have towards getting affordable housing or any new residential housing, any new housing, which could be things like property, high land costs, high development costs, or as in Danville, just maybe a lack of available land. And then most importantly and most controversial is identification of the sites that we are going to set aside to meet our housing need. Next slide, please. So how do we know what our housing need is and who gives us those numbers? Well, it's a process called the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, or the RHNA, which we've all got to know very well. And as most people are aware, the state has declared a housing crisis in California that's been going on for a number of years now. So the housing units that each community needs to plan for start at the state level. The state of California does population and housing projections for the next 8 years. And then they give those housing projections to the different COGs, or councils of government, around the different regions of California. Of course, ours here in the Bay Area is Abac. And it's up to Abac or the other regional governments to come up with a methodology for how to distribute the housing units given by the state to all of the cities and counties in that region. And then it's up to each city or county to come up with a housing plan or a housing element that shows how the housing assignment is going to be accommodated in each community. And as you can see here, about a year and a half ago, the state gave Abac, our region, a total of 441,176 housing units to distribute among the cities and counties in Abac. Next slide. So Abac, this gives you some information on contacting Abac. Abac started a process about 2 years ago now, where they set up a housing subcommittee that was called the methodology committee, and they met about once a month for a year, and they came up with a methodology for how to distribute the RHNA numbers throughout the cities and counties. Next slide, please. And ultimately, through that process and through some appeals that were filed, including by the town of Danville, Danville's ultimate number was 2,241 total housing units. Next slide. And those housing units come at 4 different affordability levels, including very low income households, low income, moderate income, and above moderate income. You can see in Danville there, the 2241. Almost half of those are at the low or very low. And what's important about that is that that means, according to the state, to qualify for low or very low housing, the densities for the developments have to be at least 30 units per acre. You can see for a comparison, Concord had just over 5,000. And if we go back down to San Ramon, they had 5,111. And most of the county is actually the unincorporated county area itself, which is 77645. Next slide. And so now we're starting to embark on our next phase of the housing element development and our public outreach and engagement. And Kat Bravo has been working on the next part of this. So I'm going to turn it over to her to explain it and to kind of go through a demonstration. Kat?
Thank you. Beginning last year, the town launched what it envisioned to be a multi-phase outreach effort on this complex housing discussion. The Danville Town Talks website was launched specifically to serve as our go-to information hub and continues to be a two-way communication tool for community members to visit for all housing-related information. You can ask questions, you can participate in discussions and other activities throughout the process. After spending much of last year producing information for nearly every media channel we have access to, we've hosted webinars similar to this one and took every opportunity to present wherever we've been invited to. We are ready to launch into the next phase of engagement, which will consist of 2 parts. Part 1 of the process was launched with the housing site suggestion map, which I will demonstrate shortly. This allows community members to drop pins on sites they believe have opportunity for future housing. During and following the close of the tool, staff will conduct an analysis of all sites suggested against each CD's site criteria. Sites that meet the state's criteria will then be incorporated into part 2 of the engagement phase. Part 2 will invite residents back to participate in a site-specific housing simulation tool called Balancing Act. Through Balancing Act, residents will be able to balance where and at what density housing could be accommodated to meet Danville's minimum housing needs allocation of 2,241. This data will help inform the town's draft housing element, which will be submitted to the state for review in August. And then following the state's review, the housing element will come back to us and it will be presented to the Planning Commission for recommendation to Town Council for adoption. So now that we have an idea of the road ahead, I will demonstrate the housing site suggestion map. This tool is accessible through the Danville Town Talks Housing Element project page and will be available through April 8th. There are 3 ways to navigate the site. You can click and drag your map around or use the zoom in and out buttons in the lower left-hand corner. You can toggle to your current location, which is great for when you're out and about around town, or you can search by a specific address. You can click on any parcel to get additional available details, including parcel ID, address, and acreage. And when you're ready to drop a pin, it's as simple as clicking and dragging the marker located in the left-hand side menu to your suggested site. Comments and or photos are an option for you to add in, which we do encourage as it gives insight as to why a site is being suggested. You do not need to be registered for the site. However, to successfully submit a suggestion, an email and screen name will need to be provided. And you can drop as many pins as you like. There's no limit. The only limit that exists is that it has to be within the town incorporated boundaries. Additional features available on the site include filtering between an individual marker or all the markers, or you can actually look at the activity feed, which is available to see what other people have marked and if anybody's left comments, why. As I mentioned, there's that toggle to your current location. This tool is accessible on a desktop as well as on any smartphone or tablet, and the features are all the same. So this is just a view from a cell phone. Now, while a pin can be dropped on any parcel within the town boundaries, it's important to note that not just any site is considered viable. As shown on this slide, there are a number of state housing laws that dictate what defines a suitable site to be included in the housing elements site inventory. So while staff will be evaluating sites suggested against the state's criteria, here are a few things that you can consider while suggesting a site. You can look at the parcel size, the existing use, or transportation access. And lastly, I will take one more opportunity to highlight ways that you can continue to participate in the process. And you can subscribe to our news feed at danvilletowntalks.org at the Housing Element Project page. You can learn more on this website about housing and its governing legislation to provide informed input. And then like this webinar, we have two more after this. We have an in-person workshop that's going to be at the Veterans Memorial Building on March 26th, and then another Zoom webinar on March 28th. And if you have any questions, we are here to answer them. And I'm not seeing any questions. So I would say if anything comes up, definitely go to the Danville Town Talks website, and you can actually ask us questions on that website, and we will answer them there for the public.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. And we look forward to getting any comments you might have.
Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.